feel like I should clarify right out of the gate that this video is not about AAA developers and the lost art of video game optimization, just in case anyone's confused or misled by the title. It is, however, tangentially related to video games. Optimization fatigue is a little made-up catchphrase that I've been meaning to coin, as I think it best, most succinctly describes a mentality towards playing video games, content creation online, learning new skills, a mentality towards these things that I believe has both frustrated and perhaps more interestingly baffled myself and many I've seen, sort of loosely discussing this topic online for a while now. I think the first time that I recognized the feeling of optimization fatigue was a few years ago when I first started playing gacha games with my cousin. I don't really play gacha games anymore, but when I started playing those games with him years ago, about the time we would clear the base content of whatever given game we were playing, he would pretty much immediately start sending me these videos, guides on the fastest way to clear this type of content, the fastest way to mine a certain type of material, how to most efficiently do this or that piece of content, farming this or that type of equipment. And before long, he was sending me videos by people who I would describe, for lack of a better term, as metafags. Basically people who only play characters who are meta, only equip builds that are fitting of the meta, and basically stick with whatever meta characters and builds they manage to acquire regardless of any other factors, except of course once there's a patch that makes them no longer the meta, at which point they throw them away without a second thought and replace them with the new meta characters and the new meta builds. I always found this totally antithetical to what the appeal of these games was for me, because these were gacha games, basically character collectathon type games where you were trying to collect the coolest characters and, experiment with different builds depending on what kind of gear, what kind of artifacts, kind of combinations you could put together. I always really lean towards using the characters that I thought looked the coolest or the sexiest, the ones that I thought had the most interesting backstories or lores, like characters that I would collect along the way and, feel some sort of weird attachment to for whatever reason. And I liked really experimenting for myself with all different kinds of builds, whether I knew they were going to be good or not, trying different combinations of characters and different combinations of artifacts and gear sets with different effects, because I wanted to do that experimenting for myself. Without ever really wanting to look up a video or a guide on any of this stuff to begin with. And so the idea of just looking up the video of whoever had the top 10 builds and just going by whatever they said, it was totally antithetical to what I felt the appeal of the game was for me to begin with. For me, this was all about collecting characters that I liked aesthetically or based on the lore in the game, and experimenting with builds that I found interesting to experiment with, even if it wasn't always efficient and, I didn't necessarily even want to confirm whether or not it was efficient in many cases, just trying to have fun the way that I seen it. And it's interesting enough to think back to when the two of us were growing up, not playing gacha games, just traditional JRPGs and the like. I remember when we were both playing Final Fantasy X quite obsessively when we were younger. He was always the type to basically clear the game within 20 hours or so, and then go back and try to do all of the bonus or New Game Plus stuff just as quickly as possible in the same way. Meanwhile, I was the type to spend upwards of 80 hours on a basic playthrough of a JRPG. I took things slow. I wanted to talk to every single NPC when I seen a cool looking vista. I wanted to sit there and soak it in, and just generally speaking, I wanted to explore every nook and cranny, even if it didn't necessarily make sense. And I really took my time with these things. And that was the way that I personally enjoyed playing JRPGs. in pretty much any game which had any element of exploration or experimentation within gameplay. And I guess this just goes to show the vast difference between how one type of player and another type of player experiences fun in the same type of game, how they may get totally different appeals out of the same experience. Now, of course, the most extreme version of this sort of mentality comes through in cooperative and competitive games. Well, obviously, I'm sure anyone who's ever played something like League of Legends or even something like Overwatch, or I haven't played it myself, but maybe today's corollary would be something like Marvel Rivals. You get into a game like this where it's competitive in a sense and cooperative in a sense, and a lot of people really expect you to pick a character and know a character who bolsters the current team lineup. They also expect you to pick a character who is relatively meta, whereas once again, my idea of fun going into a game like Overwatch, for example, is always to pick the characters that I like aesthetically, that I find fun to play, and characters that I just know at, my casual gameplay level. For me, call me a normie for this one, but it's always like Diva and Pharah, even though I probably haven't played that game in over a year. Even a game like Helldivers, where I would argue a lot of the gameplay mechanics are really built for screwing around in a lot of ways. That mentality is still there in a sense. Once again, playing with my cousin led to the same sort of thing here, where his idea of having a good time in this game was to look up the absolute fastest way to grind for marks. And this would of course dictate the kind of content he played, the way that he wanted to play it, even ways of just like cheesing missions, like not even completing the missions, just getting in and doing the most efficient way to grind for the types of marks or materials that he was looking for. And once again, for me, this was the exact opposite of what I would consider fun, which, funny enough, just led eventually to us just like throwing bombs at each other because it just descended into chaos at the point which a few of us no longer wanted to go the meta approach within the gameplay. And I wouldn't consider my cousin like an extreme version of this, so we're still able to have fun with the games even if we disagree with like the right way or the fun way to play them. But I've definitely had run-ins with, and I'm sure others have had run-ins with, people who will swear up and down that you're just playing the game the wrong way, when for me, each of these things is a place where I'm just going to have stupid fun, and that is the appeal for it for me. But for a lot of people, I think it's about competition, it's about modeling the best guides that they've seen or the best Twitch streamers that they've seen, trying to model themselves after those. They feel like it's very goal-oriented, task-oriented. They want it to be as efficient as possible. And for me, like, allowing the way that you play to be dictated by this feels like the exact opposite of fun. But that's enough about video games. I feel like this mentality also, of course, affects other things. One of the other big things that I think it has come to affect is artistic output and content creation online. We could go on and on about different ways that the commodification of content, the corporatization of platforms like YouTube, how ad things have affected it, and of course, how the Mr. Beastification has affected things, all the different pieces of advice that get thrown out over and over again, which people kind of consider the only correct way to do things online, which of course naturally leads to people creating homogeneous, barely iterative content that follows the same standard formats and the same standard topics. Not only because of the specific advice that's found in these videos, but also because a huge part of the advice is to just go find someone who's exponentially more successful than you, who has consistent success, and just model yourself after them. So many creators go find something that's already kind of boilerplate, homogeneous, barely iterative, formulaic, repetitive, that appeals to as wide an audience as possible, and then they just model themselves after that, and it's one giant Ouroboros of the most generic possible formulaic content. But the one thing that often comes to mind for me is having seen so many of these YouTube advice videos back in the day, having, listened to a lot of the Mr. Beast advice is the sort of extreme version of video curation that goes on behind like big brands, big institution level creators on YouTube, for example. The idea that a creator would make multiple videos that might all be good, but if one video seems like something that would be too controversial or simply wouldn't perform as well as the other videos and might therefore drag the overall performance of the channel down, that those videos just never see the light of day, even if they get made. And I think the basic mentality behind this is like, you have your 10 out of 10 videos which appeal to the largest common denominator, the broadest audience that you can manage to appeal to. And then you have like what a lot of these creators would probably think of as like 7s or 8s maybe. They don't appeal to as broad of an audience, or they are, you know, perhaps too controversial. And so those videos just never get made, or if they do get made, they get cut from the batch because they might drag the overall group down. This is once again, of course, like an extreme optimization approach where the idea of getting out as much good art as possible, as many good videos as possible, or the idea of getting something out just because you want it to exist and you want it to be part of the conversation might not necessarily be the most efficient approach. So there are creations you might make which should just be cut because they would drag the overall group of videos down or not appeal to a general enough audience to be worth posting at all. I don't think that this is necessarily always inherently a bad thing, neither do I think that it's totally new. If you think about it, artists who work on music have always had B-sides and demo tracks that, you know, perhaps never seen the light of day, or perhaps were only released in bonus versions of albums, for example. And it's certainly not the case that everything that a person creates should always be posted, but I do think that we've reached an excessive version of this, perhaps, at this point. I do wonder how many, like, truly great videos, how many truly great pieces of art, how many experimental songs or just experimental little instrumental guitar pieces haven't seen the light of day because the people creating them don't think of them as broadly appealing enough or technically proficient enough, or whatever it might be that they think is most optimal or efficient for garnering attention or ad space or overall views, or continuing to proliferate the same type of appeal to the broadest audience that they can reach. How many videos or art pieces in general, whatever they might be, that were great and might have appealed to a smaller demographic or a less general audience at a deeper level, how many of those things have just never seen the light of day because of the sort of incentive structures that are created by algorithmic recommendations and a sort of obsessive approach to the most efficient, most optimal way of reaching the most eyes and holding the most attention? How many of those videos that would have reached a smaller audience at the deepest possible level just never saw the light of day because of the way that these things work now? This is a question that I often find myself asking, and of course something that I'm sure has affected my own decisions about what pieces of art to create and post as well. I guess it just feels like, and maybe I'm wrong, but it feels like the acceptable approach to all this has changed a lot over the years. Whereas I remember a lot of chaotic channels from back in the day that would post lots of variety content, mixing up everything from video essays to absolute shit posts. But these days, so many of the channels that you see, especially the largest ones, the most optimized ones, they post the safest, broadest appeal content, and every video that they post is basically set up to just meet the expectations created by the previous videos. The same general topic, the same general type of content, the same format, maybe even down to essentially the same length. And somehow I completely forgot to bring up titles and thumbnails here, which have of course basically become a sort of arms race on YouTube where everyone has resulted to the nuclear option because we have accepted clickbait. The creator has accepted clickbait because they're competing with clickbait, and the viewer has accepted clickbait because clickbait is all that gets recommended to them anyways. And you can tell, of course, if you go to any YouTube advice channel that's worth its salt, that they really go out of their way to make you understand that clickbait is not a dirty word on YouTube, because you basically have to use it on some level if you intend to have any level of success here. The most obvious version of this that comes to mind for me is all the clips and videos of Think Media, where they try to make the distinction between good clickbait and bad clickbait. And I don't mean to throw any shade towards them. Obviously, they're just trying to help people be more successful on the platform and help them to understand what does and doesn't work. But every time they make this distinction between good clickbait and bad clickbait, I kind of just become completely confused as to what the real distinction is. The only distinction I seem to be able to find is that good clickbait leads to a good video and bad clickbait leads to a bad video. But then channels such as this will of course tell you that you should actually just straight up study clickbait, study the best clickbait, because you need to understand how it works so that you can have it in your tool belt, which is perfectly fair. But I think that you can tell that this has gotten to a really extreme degree because now there are like multiple forms of clickbait on YouTube. Of course, the most obvious version of this is just the sort of headlinification of titles, where you take the idea of the video, you sort of summarize it down to as short a title as possible, and you take it to the most extreme level of the idea that you possibly can, like right up until the point where the title basically becomes a lie that doesn't really represent the video anymore, and then you just go ahead and push it on a little bit further so that it just is a lie, because that's what everyone is doing anyway. And if you don't, you're competing with someone who is. But like, there's that version, the sort of traditional idea of clickbait, and then there's what is ironically, I think, even more traditional, a type of clickbait, something that I think comes from traditional headlines and traditional advertisement banners and the like from back in the day. The sort of, you won't believe what happens next, that sort of thing. The idea of a title where it's making that bold claim, but it's so vague that you don't really have any idea what the thing is going to be that you're clicking on. And once again, not to throw any shade at these guys, because I think both of them make at least some content that I do like, not universally speaking, but they do both make some content that I like. But both Moist Critical and Asmongold's editor seem to be the best examples of that I've seen in recent years. They have so many of these titles that are perfectly expertly crafted to make a big, bold claim that gets you as curious as possible, but also give you absolutely no fucking idea what the video is gonna be about. Everyone keeps recommending this, or I finally checked this out, or I can't believe I liked it as much as I did, or you won't believe what happens next. I can't believe they really did this. I can't believe they got away with this. I can't believe this is happening. The situation is insane. You know, this kind of thing. And of course, naturally, in the AniTube space, especially like in AniTube controversy, drama, piracy, censorship, etc., in these spheres, ragebait, clickbait, blah blah blah, there exists what I would almost consider like a 3-level version of clickbait, which is like the thing where you see the title and the title is the absolute most extreme version of the idea of the video. Like, it's taken it to literally like a fictional level of the idea of the video. You click on the video is kind of like, yeah, this could be true, maybe, and they're like reading from a summary article of another article, and then you go click on the actual original article, and the article itself that the summary article came from just boldly makes it clear that the thing that was being claimed might be true just isn't. And I'm trying so hard not to call anyone out here, because as per usual, the reality is even creators who I generally agree with the big picture questions on, even a lot of these people exercise these same practices, unfortunately. And I'm not even sure that it's always intentional. I know a lot of people like to act like it is always intentional. I think a lot of it just comes down to don't hate the player, hate the game. You know, people are trying to keep up with the constant news flow of certain things that they're trying to cover, and they know that to get clicks, they have to engage in the clickbait game. They know that to get consistent impressions, they have to provide a consistent stream of videos that specifically appeals to that particular audience, whether there's anything worth getting mad about today, for instance, or not. So you end up with so many of these videos covering the sort of subjects that I do find really important: censorship, piracy, etc. But the content that's getting made at basically the highest level within these spheres, it's being made super clickbaity, and there's almost no research behind it because the people feel as though the best way to do that kind of content, the best way to get eyeballs on these topics, is to just make a super clickbaity thing and don't do a lot of research, because research means that you go down a big rabbit hole and then the video doesn't get made for a couple of days. It's so much more efficient to just do 5 minutes max research, come up with the clickbaitiest title you can possibly come up with, and just riff for 10 minutes about whatever you're feeling and upload it. And so, obviously, once again, you got to keep in mind that's the reality of what you're competing with. And of course, this naturally comes back to the whole optimization fatigue idea. Obviously, I'm quite tired of that. I don't know that there's a lot that you can really do about it necessarily, but it's pretty much impossible not to immediately think about these videos that I've been releasing the past couple of weeks on the new episodes of Freerun. I've really been trying to go out of my way to brand them as honestly as possible and make sure that people understand before they click on it that this is just going to be a sort of unscripted, rambling reaction to the newest episode. And so I name it the basic idea of like what the vibe of the episode and my reaction was, and then I say Freerun Season 2 Episode 1, Freerun Season 2 Episode 2. But naturally, as a result of doing that, instead of just coming up with a title that makes each new episode sound like the best thing that's ever happened, naturally, the click-through rates of these videos are like a fifth of the kind of content that I often make. And, you know, perhaps it should be. I guess because of that sort of analytical performance, even though I'm covering a topic that a lot of people who typically view my channel are clearly really into. I've got multiple videos on Freerun that have tens of thousands of views, but the videos aren't performing that analytically well. Probably a lot of that is to do with the titles being straightforward and honest, and because of that, the videos don't get any impressions. You know, maybe I'm wrong, but that seems to be the obvious conclusion. But for me, like, labeling these videos this way is an attempt for me to do a service to the viewership, to be completely honest about exactly what this video is. But ultimately, maybe that attempt to do an honest service, to brand the thing properly, just to call it what it is just me shooting myself in the foot. After all, if I were to just go full optimization mode on the titles, get them down to 4 or 5 words a piece, make each of them sound like the best thing that's ever happened, they probably would get a lot more views. But I would obviously feel like the title were just dishonest, because these videos aren't on the same level as what I'm usually doing, in my opinion. And I would like people to understand that pretty well before they click. It's just me reacting like right after I watch the episode. Totally unscripted, rambling. You know, anyway, I'm spinning my wheels on this. Okay, but I would like to at least provide some kind of positive counterpoint to that, because I do feel like I'm pretty cynical on that point. I'm not going to repeat everything that he says in his video. Definitely wouldn't be able to summarize it well anyway, but if you're interested in a much more measured, reasonable, and positive take on the subject of clickbait, Veritasium has a really good video called Clickbait is Unreasonably Effective, which I only just found out about recently myself. It's really good and definitely did help me to come to terms with the reality of some of this stuff. However, I will say the one thing that I found left out of this optimistic outlook, and that I forgot to talk about myself here is the effect that it's had on the actual process of creating videos for so many people. There was a time when people just came up with the most interesting video or the most interesting concept or most compelling argument for a video. But today the reality is a lot of people literally just come up with the most interesting clickbait title and thumbnail that they can think of and then kind of mold an idea around the really good clickbait that they came up with. I've even seen many people recommend this advice in the past, and it just leaves the whole thing once again feeling much more cynical than it once did, in my opinion. People will often refer to this as coming up with a good idea first, but I disagree with that framing. I think that's pure cope, because when you craft a title and thumbnail first, you're not coming up with a good video idea, you're coming up with a good marketing strategy, and then trying to turn a marketing strategy into a good video. And call me cynical on this point, but I think a lot of people have convinced themselves to make videos that they might not necessarily firmly believe in themselves. After all, they didn't start by crafting a compelling argument or a piece of art that they believed in. They started by brainstorming a good marketing strategy. Obviously, this was supposed to be the positive side. Not sure what to tell you still, though I am going to drop that Veritasium video link below because it is a really good positive take on the subject, and I don't really feel like I'm capable of providing that myself. But anyway, don't put spoilers in your thumbnails, people. I mean, for the love of... There are obviously all sorts of other directions that this concept of optimization fatigue and just this general idea of this mentality, you know, for better or for worse. I'm not trying to judge anyone for approaching video games or art or content or life or whatever it might be this way, but obviously other things that this affect. I think a lot of people think of learning in the same way, you know, whether it's learning a musical instrument or learning a new language. There's certainly a divide, I think, between people who think of learning these things in the most possible optimal way, like the most, you know, this is based on neuroscience, don't do that thing that you've been doing, this is the only proper way to learn guitar or to learn that language as fast and as deeply as possible, versus the people who are really all about just diving in, throwing oneself to the wolves, perhaps, in a sense, but by just learning the way that feels natural, learning the way that feels fun. Just totally different ways of approaching things. Personally, I tend to find that if I obsess too much over optimization of these things, I just end up not being all that interested anymore. And I think that's how a lot of people feel. Once again, the language learning community is a big place that I've been seeing this lately, but I've seen a lot of this from the guitar community as well. People who totally decry repeating the thing that you're currently learning and increasing the metronome because they say, well, it's not the most efficient way to learn it, so you should be doing it this way instead. Obviously, another part of this is just people looking for novel new things to promote in their videos so that they can get that click. That's probably a part of it too, but I do think there's kind of just a huge divide between these two mentalities, which is just interesting more than anything, I guess. And one last little subtopic that I feel is apt for the conversation. I'm not really sure where I'll throw this in, but it feels like it would be goofy not to at least touch on it for a moment, and that is, of course, AI. Now, for the record, I'm not totally against the idea of using any AI. I think a lot of what you would call like rudimentary AI technologies are incredibly useful and don't like actually kill the creative process itself. For example, like voice to text transcription programs and transcription features. These are so helpful for just more quickly finding the piece of a video that you're looking for so that you can edit that thing that, you know, you weren't sure exactly where it was in the video. Also, just for research purposes, as long as you're double checking things and not just research, but also like finding something that you're not sure exactly was, like, I will admit I'm totally guilty of occasionally going to Grok and asking it, hey, there's this one scene in Konosuba where all the girls are like judgmentally staring at Kazuma, and I can't remember which episode it was. You'd be surprised how often Grok knows exactly what episode you're asking about, and can even tell you like the context, which will help you to find the thing. But obviously that's not what everyone is using this stuff for, and in many cases I think a lot of people have kind of optimized themselves out of the most satisfying part of creative outlets. I mean, call me old-fashioned, but for me, what really makes making music truly fun and satisfying is that there's a period of struggle and experimentation and trying to make something work that doesn't quite work, and producing songs that just aren't very good and getting rid of those and moving on to the next thing. All of that struggle makes the moment when you realize you've really put something together that you love and you want to show people, it makes that moment so meaningful and so satisfying. And I think, unfortunately, we are in an era where a lot of people who might have otherwise learned how to play an instrument or how to write music is instead just prompting stuff, and unfortunately, as much as a lot of people like to deny it, some of it's really fucking good, and you know, that's terrifying, but it's reality, and it is certainly part of the optimization fatigue. It's always, you know, sort of a worm in the back of your head to know that there are so many things in the process that you could just do with an AI. And yeah, I don't know, I don't want to harp on that for too long, because like some of the other things in this video, I would just like to talk about these things in dedicated videos later, but thought it was at least worth bringing up given the natural relevance to the topic. Personally, I think that there are certainly ways to use especially rudimentary AI technologies to help get rid of the really boring, menial parts of the creative process, but I would always prefer for it to be a tool. I want to make the creative decisions, and I also personally want to consume art where those little individual decisions were made by people, so that there's actually a reason to ask the question, why did they do this? What does this mean? If an AI, like a glorified pattern generation system, you know, or someone's 10-sentence prompt was really the heart and soul of an entire piece of quote-unquote art, I think that those questions are entirely pointless. Why even ask what it means? It doesn't mean anything. No one made those individual decisions that give a piece of art what people often vaguely call its soul. And I understand people's reticence to take something as vague as it just doesn't have soul seriously, but for me, it's one of those things that's always going to be in the back of my mind. As soon as I find out, as soon as I know for whatever reason that the thing was made with AI, with some sort of prompt, all those questions that I ask that makes consuming the art interesting kind of just evaporate and become totally pointless, in my opinion. But anyway, I'm gonna wrap it up there before I just start rambling on random AI stuff. Back to wherever we were, or if this is the end of the video. Anyway, I guess that's all I've got to say about optimization fatigue and efficiency for now. I'm sure there's a pile of stuff that was right there in my head during the shower thought moments and driving around in the car thinking about this, but the more I do this, I'm sure the better I'll get at actually bringing it back to the front of my mind when I sit down in front of the camera. So more practice, right? More practice. Hope you enjoyed this. Hope you found it interesting. If you have another approach or another direction that you think would be interesting to take this conversation in, obviously drop it in the comments below, and have a good one.